Let's get started in cultural anthropology. We're looking at the question, what is cultural anthropology? As we ask that question, there's a number of things that you'll be reading in the book, and I'll do a quick overview of what's already in the book. So this will be kind of a review lesson. If you read the book, watch this lecture, you'll be fine. So what is cultural anthropology? There are several ways to define it. The first way to define it is simply to break the word down. Anthropos means human, humankind, and logos means the study of. So it literally is the study of humans. The key components involved in anthropology. Anthropology seeks to use information about humans, individual humans and groups of humans, regardless of time, geographic location, culture, types of evidence, looking at humanity as a whole. It studies biological, physiological, social, and cultural aspects of being human, both in the present and in the past. It draws on knowledge and methods from any discipline that can help us understand humanness. For instance, it might draw on psychology. In our case, we would look at biblical theology as a starting point or as a piece of information that we need to strongly consider in what it means to be human. But obviously, biblical theology doesn't hold every understanding of humanness that every field of anthropology might. In developing our theology, we can actually look to anthropology to understand, what does science show us? What does the world show us about what it means to be human? In our case, we're looking at cultures, and different cultures describe humanness in different ways. So what is the cultural description of humanness? That's what we're going for. And so anthropology seeks to integrate information into a single picture of what it means to be human. But there are four different fields of anthropology that we should consider, and we're only going to be looking at one of these. First one is physical anthropology. This is the biology of what it means to be human, looking at the physical characteristics of humans over time. Those who believe in some sort of evolution look at the physical changes over time and try to understand those physical changes. We would probably look at that and talk about not so much of an evolution as an adaptation over time, and how do humans physically adapt to their environment? We do. And so we go through changes, even very minor changes, when we adapt into another climate zone. But humans growing up within a certain region of the world do take on a change of physical characteristics. And so looking at the biology of that, how the environment affects biology and all sorts of things like that. Archaeology, pretty obvious to us, as the second one here. The definition is the study of the material remains of human cultures from the past and the present. We'll be studying things that people make, like the artifacts they make, pottery and tools, things that they've left behind, and also things that people alter, such as buildings and roads, and how humans over time and in different times have altered their environment. Looking for clues for how people lived in different times can also tell us what the different environmental factors were and how ecology has changed over time, and how humans have changed ecology over time. Looking at material culture as the role of the archaeologist. You will, as part of your cultural anthropology, look at artifacts, because artifacts can be a clue to what's going on in the environment and what's going on in the culture. What do people use? What do they make? What do they wear? Those are things that you should be paying attention to as a cultural anthropologist. The third one is linguistics, and you will be studying language, but linguistics is a deeper study of how language works and how communication works, how languages are produced, how they're organized, how they change over time, how different cultures have different languages, what languages relate to what languages, and all sorts of things like that. Roles like ethnolinguists, who study a particular language and how it affects the way people think. Sociolinguistics would be studying how language use changes in different social situations, which is actually something you will look at a bit in your environment, because you need to understand that when you're with an older person or with a younger person, do you speak differently? Do they carry themselves differently? Is there a change of aspect in the communication that happens when you're in a different social setting? Obviously, we do that. We speak differently in church than on a football field. Then lastly, it is the field that we're looking at, and that's cultural anthropology. It's also sometimes called social anthropology or socio-cultural anthropology, and there's little nuances there I won't go into right now. The book does define some of that. It's a study of contemporary and historic human societies through their cultures. We're looking at the people we're with. We're trying to understand them by understanding the culture they share. We do that by studying things like the rules for kinship and how they organize families, the way their society is organized and how the government works, or how authority works within a smaller community, within relationships. What does power look like? We would also look at how they relate to other cultures and what levels of ethnocentrism they might have. The way society orders itself in terms of people relationships, who relates to who and who can relate to who, and how does economics, as well as power, as well as gender, as well as race, figure into all of those kinds of things. So you're trying to understand the culture you're in, and that's what we want to do in this course. Not so much archaeology, not really looking at physical anthropology, relating it to linguistics, relating it to some of these things, but we're really looking at what is the culture of these people that you're there to learn from, live among, and serve. Okay, so with that in mind, a bit of the development of cultural anthropology, the book gives a pretty good statement of how this happens, but a lot of the early thinking about cultural anthropology grew out of Western culture during the colonial era. That's not where we're at right now. We don't do cultural anthropology that way, but a lot of the early thinking about cultural anthropology grew up in the colonial era, where people were documenting stories of native peoples that they were coming into contact with as Europeans expanded all over the globe in the ships going to these other places, and they come back to Europe and they would tell their stories of these strange cultures. Sometimes what they told was pretty strange. Sometimes their interpretation was pretty strange. It created a European fascination with other cultures and therefore created this field of looking at cultures, so cultural anthropology, where people began to try to understand things. The field of cultural anthropology has changed so much since that time. They were doing cultural anthropology from that perspective. It often was a very narrow perspective where one person would give their documented observations, but because it was limited to one person and it was not peer reviewed, it was not held accountable in any ways, people could pretty much say what they wanted when they came back to Europe about other peoples around the world. During the same time, the theory of evolution was growing. You have this idea of humans evolving from one species to another, the evolution of species. And that kind of came into the European mindset with the idea that there was also an evolution of society. And that in order to become a modern society, societies had to go through these different stages. So if you met a group of people somewhere in the world that was a foraging society, that means they just lived off subsistence, gathering what they could to live on, say in the jungles of the Amazon, you would say, well, they're a very primitive society because they were less evolved sociologically and culturally than other cultures. So here's the stages of development that were kind of put there. You move from a foraging society to a pastoral society where you're starting to domesticate animals, to a horticultural society, which you're actually intentionally planting crops, but using mostly hands and hand tools, and then to an agricultural society, to more of a where it's more of a large scale farming and more mechanized approach, the use of plows, use of advanced tools. And so there was this conception that societies just move from one to the other. What has happened since those theories came about is the very obvious evidence that people in societies that are currently, say Amazon basin again, were in recent human history, were foraging societies, jumped into other societies. If this theory were true, they skipped a step. And so what we've actually seen is actually all humans on the face of the planet are capable of doing anything. Their cultures hold them back somewhat. Their technology holds them back because they haven't had the contact with that technology. But you give them that technology and they learn it very quickly. They don't have to evolve through it. And so cultural evolution is one of those things that we just kind of, oh, I guess that doesn't actually work. One of the things I think is important to note is that culture is not the same as race. Early anthropologists, especially European and American, often identified primitive societies with races and therefore put the concept of primitive on whole race. And this is actually the antecedent to slavery. It's actually a justification for slavery. Oh, well, these people are from primitive cultures, therefore they're less culturally advanced. Therefore, they're only capable of certain things. They're only capable of simple farming, but we can use that labor for our simple tasks. That phase of anthropology messed things up quite a bit with this idea of evolution of society. These people are not capable of evolving to the next level, but we can integrate them into our society by letting them do what they're capable of, which is menial tasks. That became a justification for slavery and colonialism. The idea that we had to provide government for them because they weren't capable of providing their own government. That was a colonial mentality. So you can see some of the dangers that came out of those early theories. And now, of course, we look at it very differently. We look at it in terms of cultural relativism. There's actually 4 terms that get mixed up sometimes and that are not the same thing. I show them overlapping here because they do pull at each other, and your identity tends to be linked to all 4. Let's describe each. The 4 are race, culture, nationality, and ethnicity. Sometimes we use these interchangeably, but there's a distinction. The concept of race began as a biological concept. So different races were identified by physical characteristics. So you have these different races that were identified. There were 5 broad categories that anthropologists used early on. Those were Caucasoid, Mongoloid, Negroid, American Indian, and Malayan. Later biological research indicated that biological differences between races is actually pretty minimal. And therefore, race has actually been seen now more as a social construct delineated based on physical perception, primarily on skin and hair color. If you divide the world into races like Asiatic, Caucasoid or Caucasian, Negroid or Black, African American in America, and Native American, Southeast Asian for Malayan, and others that have been identified as categories have emerged. If you look at the biological difference between us, we're 99.99% the same, physiologically, genetically. There's just not that much racial difference in terms of genetics, in terms of who we actually are. We are people and share most of the same aspects, but we look very different from each other. There are groups of people from different regions of the world who have different physical characteristics, but it's not the primary thing that is the difference between our humanity. It's true that within even cultures around the world of one race see themselves as sub-races or perceived subcategories. All right, so then the second category here is ethnicity. The idea of ethnicity is a biological connection based on a specific heritage or lineage. So we're ethnically the same, which means we come from the same clan or group within an area of the world. Examples of ethnicity might be Germanic, Bantu, Semitic, Celtic, Aztec, Ojibwe, or Kurdish. Ethnicity is sometimes used to describe all that it encompasses in terms of life, way, or culture. For instance, we might say, while in Mexico, we ate traditional ethnic food while watching ethnic dances. In other words, cultural artifacts related to a specific ethnic group. Ethnicity being more of a clan or tribal or people group mentality. That's where we use the term people group, the ethnic groups of the world. The third circle in this diagram was nationality. Of course, that has to do with a sociologically described geopolitical structure. There are many nations in the world. Those nations are defined by geographical boundaries and political systems, which organize the people within those boundaries. They often have very little to do with the ethnic or cultural groups, although there can be a crossover. You might say Germany is a country, but within Germany, how many ethnic groups exist within Germany? Is there a ethnicity to being German that's bigger, or is it more in the regional ethnicities of the different German peoples and the different peoples who live within Germany? The same would be true in America. What is the ethnicity of Americans? Multi-ethnic. This is Daniel Kaluuya. He started his vocabulary on the Black Panther, if you recall. He said, I'm dark-skinned. When I'm around Black people, I'm made to feel other because I'm dark-skinned. I've had to wrestle with that, with people going, you're too Black. Then I come to America and they say, you're not Black enough. And I go to Uganda and I can't speak the language. In India, I'm Black. In the Black community, I'm dark-skinned. In America, I'm British. Bro. So he has a nationality of being British, an ethnicity of being Ugandan, and a race of being Black. So those make up his identity and who he is. He's seen as all three of those. I liked his quote here that he can't win because of the way his ethnicity, nationality, and race interact with each other. And then lastly is culture. And when we talk about culture, we're talking about life ways, the way people organize the way they live, the sociological groupings based on multiple factors, the sociological groupings based on ethnicity, nationality, economic status, regional affiliation, all of those come in to define our culture. So we can talk in terms of American culture, but even within America, there are many different cultures. How big or how small do you want that to go? We're looking at specific ethnic groups, and we're trying to understand how to reach that ethnic group with the gospel. We want to see unreached peoples reach with the gospel. So what are these peoples like? What is their culture? And it's defined by their shared values and practices, their beliefs, their behavior, their artifacts. It might refer to nationality or ethnicity. It might refer to some other grouping. There are social subgroupings within any culture as well. You can talk about Native American culture, but what are you really talking about? Are you talking about Ojibways? Are you talking about Hopi, Navajo? Who are you talking about? And do they each have their own unique culture? We also have subcultures living within any country. So we might talk about the cultural differences between age groups, cultural differences between boomers and Gen X's, things like that. Or we might talk about the culture of an organization. Generally, we're talking about ethnic groups like the Kikuyus of Kenya, the Ilocanos in the Philippines, the Akimos in Southwest United States, or the Maoris in New Zealand. If we talk in broader terms like French culture or Japanese culture, we tend to be painting a bigger stroke that might not be applicable to every person within Japan or France. Even within French, the French culture would be defined as having a Parisian culture and a Riviera culture. And so they're very different ways of life. I grew up in America. I'm ethnically British. I'm a mix of Scot, English, and Irish, but I actually have no identity tied to British heritage. It's simply my ethnicity in this point, but my culture has nothing to do with that. My culture is more defined by growing up in New Mexico, spending most of my adult years in Minnesota, and spending 11 years in the Philippines. I probably identify more with Filipinos than I do with Scots. We each have our own things that shape our culture as well. And then, as I said, we have organizational cultures. Define shared, learned, and inherited behaviors, norms, practices, customs, values, beliefs, and artifacts. So all of those things that people share As you're looking at this group of people, what are the behaviors that they share? What are the norms? What is right and wrong according to their culture? What practices do they have? What are the life ways? What do they do when they go about life in an ordinary way every day? What does that look like? And how does it look different than your life? What are some of the values and beliefs? What are some of the artifacts that they use? You can define that very quickly: the food they eat, the clothing they wear, those kinds of things. It's a question of life way. What is the way people live as a group of people, and how do they share that together? What we want you to do, and as you're going through this, you should be developing through participant observation, through doing ethnography, you should be developing somewhat of an anthropological perspective. That's a perspective that allows you to see cultural practices, beliefs, activities, and so on that influence perspective of the people there, and how they're predisposed to either engage or reject the gospel. Ultimately, it comes down to that for us. Or maybe even more importantly, how do we bridge between our culture and theirs to give them the opportunity to understand the gospel? When we look at a different culture, we're looking at the things that they believe that might be hindrances to the gospel. Just as in Jesus's day, certain beliefs of Jewish people became a stumbling block to accepting Jesus. Are there stumbling blocks within their culture that keep them from hearing the gospel and understanding it? Are there stumbling blocks in your culture? Are there ways in which you think that cause you to say things in a certain way that keep the gospel veiled to other people? And that's why we study this. That's why it's important to us. So we're developing a new perspective. And that led us to the concept of cultural relativism, which was mentioned in the book. Simply put, cultures are relative to their context. And as the book points out, this has nothing to do with relativistic thinking. It's simply to say that each culture has its own perspective. Each culture is relative to its context. Within the context of a culture, it makes sense. It answers questions of importance. It integrates the whole of culture. It gives meaning to life, but they may be wrong. American culture has things that give meaning to life to people, but they're totally off base. When you view from an outside, it might not make any sense. And that's why we try to get an insider perspective as much as possible. A simple example that we'll look again later in the course is time. Some cultures value time over relationships. Other cultures value relationships over time. Western culture has a strong value of time, and we like to keep it, save it, use it, give it, take it. Other cultures view time as a context within which relationships happen and activities happen. So for the Westerner, value of time means that we like to hold our schedules, keep our schedules strongly. If you value me as a person, you will respect my time. Okay? Many cultures around the world allow time to be fluid to show their respect toward each other. So if I'm late to visit you because I met my cousin on the way and I gave time to him so that we could catch up, when you see me and I tell you that's why I'm late, because I was with my cousin, you will see me as a person who respects my family and honors the relationships I have. Therefore, you will feel warm and comfortable with the way I've treated you by being late. That doesn't sound right, but it is the way they would see it. If you honor your cousin that way, if I become a good friend with you, you will honor me that way. And if I need you at some point in time, you will give me your attention as well. It becomes a sign of respect, a sign of a good person who uses their time appropriately rather than segments it to little blocks and demands to keep those blocks like those silly Westerners do. So time as a perspective makes sense in one system one way and makes sense in another system the other way because of the other factors of our culture and the way our culture interacts. The way we view time works for us, but it doesn't work for other people the same way. And it's the same thing. Time is the same thing, but we have a cultural relativism towards time. Cultural relativism simply says in order to understand a culture, you cannot define it using your own cultural concepts. You actually have to get inside of it, learn their perspective, learn the perspective of life from the people, and try to understand the way they understand life. It's so important bringing the gospel to others. We often miss it in our presentation of the gospel because we simply don't understand how the people of another culture can perceive us, and therefore we miscommunicate.